Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's great to see so many of you here this Wednesday afternoon for yet another one of our new faculty lectures. We're very excited about this series and excited about today's event. So without further ado, let me introduce, and it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Amanda Putnam, who is a new associate professor in the Department of English here at UCO, as well as the chairperson of the Department of English. Dr. Putnam's work focuses on transnational Black women's literature, and her teaching and research look in particular at socially constructed categories within race, gender, and sexuality. Her scholarly interests also include investigating the racial and gendered spaces within television and film. Dr. Putnam has published articles that discuss the representations of women in Star Trek, in Grey's Anatomy, in Disney princess movies, and in Survivor. Dr. Putnam's talk this afternoon is titled Gendered Things, Fighting the Demogorgon, One Stereotype at a Time. And hopefully after this presentation, we'll have some time for questions, answers, and discussion. But right now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Putnam to our virtual forum.
Hello. So I am going to assume that most people are familiar with Stranger Things, which is the show on Netflix. And if you aren't, well, this might be a wild ride, as we talk about demogorgons and psychokinetic powers and things like that. But bear with me. So I am going to share my screen just to move things along so that you're looking at some of the images from the show. So I'm going to do this now. Okay, so I believe that you can see my screen. Okay, and so what I want to start off with is saying that I feel like that Stranger Things first introduced a trio of pretty strong female characters. And what they were doing was upending some of the gendered stereotypes that we had going into it, and sort of flipped the script to really show very strong female power. So we end up with, the first one is, of course, 11, our psychokinetic tween girl with limited conversational skills. We also have Nancy, who is a much more typical female teenager in high school. And then we have Joyce, who is Will's mother, who is the boy who gets trapped in the alternate dimension with this, Demogorgon. And so the series is engaging very strongly historical nostalgia and contrasting these three resilient female protagonists, not only with each other, but with varied groups of Will's rescuers. So in the first series, that's Nancy and Jonathan. It's Joyce and Chief Hopper, Will's three best friends, plus 11. And then in later seasons, this builds. So we end up with having Max, skateboarder Max. We have the telekinetic sister 8. We have an ice cream worker and Russian translator, Robin. We have little sis, but master manipulator, Erica. And then we also even have Susie, who is the girlfriend and a fairly minor character, but they're all sort of transgressive teen tween female characters who appear in the second and third seasons and, likely the upcoming fourth season. And they all seem to have these impressive abilities to fight monsters from the upside down. And in doing so, they start to topple some of these oppressive stereotypes that are connected with the 1980s. And so these gendered contrasts start to advance sort of broader visions of girlhood and womanhood, transforming what we expect to see from within that 1980s backdrop and 1980s horror/thriller into just blistering versions of female authority and strength that better suit current times. So they're basically reinventing themselves, altering what we understand about girlhood, womanhood, and heroism. So I'm going to start just with 11, and I'm going to be jumping around because as I've been writing this, I've noticed that I probably have far too much for an article, for just one article, and I am going off on different areas. So bear with me. But we first meet 11 as this shaved head lab prisoner, and she immediately starts to challenge traditional images of adolescent girlhood via this very initial disturbing appearance. And her understanding of social interactions is really limited. And of course, she has this amazingly potent mental power. And so we meet her first on the run, where she is shoving fistfuls of French fries in her mouth in Benny's diner. And we have one of our very first moments of gendered nuance here, because first Benny screams at her because of this boy stealing from him. But then when he realizes that she is female and has a shaved head, he changes his tone, because all of a sudden he's seeing this frayed hospital gown and realizes that there is some kind of unknown trauma that has been inflicted here. And I think it's important that these first images of 11 reflect her fragility. It reflects her suffering as she remains silent, even though Benny is attempting to entice her with food and friendship. But so we immediately see that this physical fragility is contrasting with her powerful psychokinetic abilities, because this friendship between them is almost immediately severed because we have the Hawkins Laboratory SWAT team attempting to recapture 11. They murder Benny in the process, which then also allows 11 to release her impressive mental abilities, and she kills several security guards on her escape. So we've got these moments where we have vulnerability with intense power, trauma with friendliness. And I think these balances and imbalances continue to deepen over the course of the series. And then we also realize that anybody around 11 is going to be in danger by the fact that we've got this lab that's trying to recapture her, and in danger of her because she's deadly, and we see it right away. But like I said, they immediately connect her with being feminine. So with 11's connections with these three boys, Mike, Dustin, and Lucas, who are all searching for Will, she also starts to learn certain things that allow her to eventually have a gendered identity. And so within them, she learns about friendship, autonomy, and gender. And this changes her from basically this non-gendered persona into a more recognizable 1980s tween girl. So we know that the boys have clear rules and expectations about behavior and trust. And we learn a lot about their friendship up front, like, that they're all riding, retro Schwinn cruisers, BMX bikes around town. They're playing Dungeons and Dragons. They're tormented by school bullies. They're fascinated by science and technology. So these three boys have the right skills and interests for a story about an electromagnetic monster from another realm. And within their friendships, she starts to learn about promises, something that you can't break. She learns about friends, that they are somebody you do anything for. She learns that friends tell each other things. These are all quotes from the show. Of course, friends don't lie. All these aspects of what friendship is. And the boys use a lot of 1980s references to signify meaning. They talk about Yoda, they talk about the Force, they talk about Lando Calrissian, the X-Men, Green Lanterns, the D&D's, the Veil of Shadows, and they pepper their conversations with all these 1980s shorthand that helps explain their own friendships. as well as possible betrayals. And so we see these 1980s setting, and they are a marker for viewers. We expect certain things when we see it. So when we see the bikes, we think of E.T. and all those kids going on the bikes. When we see the Christmas lights and Will communicating through a phone or the radio, we see Poltergeist. And so within this framework, we're also ready to see other aspects of the 1980s. And all of these discussions within the boys lay the foundation for their bonded friendship, as well as help viewers evaluate whether other people in this series are friends or not, and or if they are breaking promises. So we have a lot of these rules held up front for them. And by modeling this behavior, they start to teach Eleven about her own personhood and decision-making. So Mike helps to do this too, because he rejects, for example, Dustin's attempt to get Eleven to perform, asking her to lift something off the ground with her mind as a trick. And Mike says, she's not a dog. And then also asks her questions about whether she wants the bathroom door closed or not, allowing her to choose based on her comfort level. So all of these rules about friendships and about whoever pushes first must offer his hand to the other person in friendship, whoever draws first blood, in terms of these quotes, helps us to see Eleven as a person with choices, with a mind, and with expected behaviors, okay? Now in my article, I start to go into season 2 and season 3 with like Max and Nancy also helping Eleven determine her own limits, but I'm going to move ahead just so that I can keep this thing going, okay? Because once Eleven's personhood has been established, my theory is that the series quickly moves into feminizing her, okay? And before we go into that, because they have marked her as being female and one of the most deadly weapons. So this made me start to think about female superheroes in general, okay? So female superheroes in general have been feminized, but they are feminized mainly via their sexuality. And you can, whoops, I didn't mean to go back. I'll go forward. So we see this with Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games. Now, in that, there is an audience implicit in that, which makes her wear these costumes, but still they have this idea of sexualizing her. You can see it in Star Trek with various characters, but certainly Borg 7 of 9. You can see it with Tomb Raider, Angelina Jolie's Lara Croft. You can see it with the Marvel female superheroes. All of these are highly potent killers, but they are also highly sexualized. And that is not, well, before I get there, so connecting femaleness with a killer instinct is not new. That's something that has happened before. But what is new, and this could be related to her age, is to connect a gendered lens without that hypersexuality of the costuming. So it will be interesting, I think, to start seeing in season 4 if they continue to do that, because with the actor getting older and being able to be sexualized in a way that a 12-year-old might not be able to be, we'll have to see how that plays out. But so in the beginning, Eleven really doesn't have an understanding of gendered expectations. She has no concept that she's really a different gender than the 3 boys who find her. When she receives clean clothes, she starts to change right in front of them and they freak out. They're like, whoa, no, stop, and really very concerned about the fact that she has no understanding of privacy. Lucas and Dustin recount this behavior later, even wondering whether she, quote, slept naked since she was so unaccustomed, so unconcerned about undressing in front of them. And Lucas even dubs her the freak and the weirdo because she doesn't have this understanding of privacy, of personhood, and certainly not of the feminine. In direct contrast, Nancy, who we've already seen a little bit, when she begins to change in her boyfriend's room, Steve, she specifically asks for privacy from him, but then changes her mind and then removes her shirt deliberately in front of him. So these are two things where it's marking a gendered moment, one with sexual provocation and one without it. So we see these similar situations much differently depending on how each character is acting, one unaware of gender and one highly aware of it. Similarly, you see 11's name also marks a transition into femininity. So she's tattooed by the lab, and the girl is named after a number. Okay, and we find out that there's other children in season 2, but her name signifies no gender, except that the boys offer her a nickname, Elle, which of course this is short for 11, but Elle, E-L-L-E, of course means she in French. And so while they are giving her a shorter, more personalized nickname, they are also unmistakably renaming her with a feminine name that they can better deal with, that they can better understand her. She also starts to learn a lot more about girlhood by looking at Nancy's room. So she touches a white-coated iron bed with flourishes of pillows and frilly girl patterns and the jewelry box. And she starts to compare this to her barren cell room. And this is starting to make her recognize her own lack of humanity or humanness from others, you know, from within the lab, her own lack of girlness, of family. And she recognizes this sort of within the safety of the boys' friendship, because she can start to explore her own humanity and girlhood more definitively. Then, in a very big moment, as you can see on the picture, the boys transform 11 physically, okay? And the purpose here is so that she can enter their school without notice. But instead of doing what would be easy, for example, giving her their clothes, which is boy clothes, and having her just put a baseball cap over her shaved head, they go to much more specific lengths. And they choose a smocked pink dress, a blonde shoulder leg wig, and they give her makeup. So this is clearly marked for a girl. And then the boys agree that Elle is now, quote, pretty, as she conforms more clearly to the gendered appearance of a girl. And so then Elle starts to emulate them, saying she must be pretty good since she's doing this. Now, we as viewers can recognize the limitations of this kind of bizarre makeover. She's still wearing tube socks, you know, and sneakers, and the makeup isn't quite right. She doesn't really look like other junior high or high school girls. She doesn't look like Nancy, for example, but she can be identified as a girl. Let me keep going. And this later, I'm going to keep moving on. These machinations to confirm 11's femininity, I think, work in contrast to her repeated actions where she's attacking or killing others using this psychokinetic power. So she's slamming doors, she's breaking a bully's arm, she's making him wet his pants, she's knocking people unconscious and throwing them against a bus. She is tossing vans in the air. She's, you know, killing mass forces of the SWAT team in the school, and all with this psychokinetic power that is signified by the bleeding nose and the ears, eventually setting up the biggest altercation of the series, where she takes on the monster. But they're very eager to connect her with femininity and with girlhood, to make sure that we see that. And 11's appearance continues to change. We won't go into all of these different changes because I want to look at a couple of other characters, but you can see even in season 3 and in season 2 and 3 that she continues to figure out how she is going to be feminine, also always within that setting of the 80s, where she's, you know, got the goth, and then she's got the bright colors of the 1980s and things like this. But I do want to move on to Nancy and Steve at this point, two other characters who I think are really, really important in terms of stereotypes and personhood. So we've got Nancy and Steve, where Nancy is first cast clearly as this 1980s nerd girl. You know, she's selected by the similar, the male stereotype, the good-looking, wealthy athlete / bully. If you've watched any 80s movies, you've seen this couple, right? And so it's even more interesting to me that Nancy transforms throughout the series from this awkward schoolgirl into this promising journalist, eventually becoming a sharpshooter, basically, against the Demogorgon and, you know, various other people, the Mind Flayer and all of these, okay? So in the beginning, she is introduced overstudying, missing out on high school fun until she attracts Steve. So and the series even pokes fun at itself, I think, regarding these stereotypes by putting a scene, you know, in around Steve's backyard pool where they're drinking alcohol, and his parents are out of town because, of course, they are. And Nancy says to Steve, "You are a cliche. You do realize that." And Steve responds, "You are a cliche with your grades and your band practice." And they're both correct. They personify 1980s cliches. And this is what makes them so much more fun to watch as they move beyond the cliched realities. But first, Nancy follows that 1980s teen movie script. She betrays her friendship with Barb, leaving her alone so that she can have sex with her new boyfriend, Steve. And of course, Barb is going to be captured by the monster and brought into the Upside Down. So we're right there with the 1980s plot. But if we were following the 1980s script on movies at this point, Nancy would have been the one to die violently, right? Because most 1980s slasher films or horror films kill off anybody who is surprisingly unlucky by getting lucky, right? And instead, we watch a series of cuts between Nancy's first sexual experience and Barb's descent into the Upside Down, where she is tormented by the Demogorgon and eventually killed. And it is very obvious that there's some relationship between these two. But Stranger Things seems to be teaching something different than what those 1980s stereotypes do, because Nancy goes home. She doesn't die. Now, you could argue that she gets punished because Barb disappears, and that's her friend. And that's a little bit of something I'm still working with here. But the fact that she loses her virginity, and that's a normal part of life, and that you could be a decent person afterwards. And in fact, you could be heroic and save the world. And that's what starts to happen when we have some of these changes in Nancy and then Steve. So if we have the flipping of the script, Nancy starts to reflect on what she's been doing. And she says, "Last week I was shopping for a new top I thought Steve might like. You know, it took Barb and I all weekend. It seemed like life and death. And now," and this is what Jonathan says, "you're shopping for bear traps with Jonathan Byers." So by joking about what they're doing now, in contrast to this lighthearted shopping expedition with Barb, Nancy starts to show a deepening understanding of her own role in a less gendered friendship as with Jonathan, as well as a gendered relationship with Steve. Okay. And additionally, prior to this bear trap shopping trip, they go shooting at cans, and it is Nancy who succeeds at this experiment. So she is the one we see carrying and using the gun later, while Jonathan admits he can't hit the can. So he uses a baseball bat fitted with nails, right? But in other words, when we learn that Nancy is the one who can shoot straight, we start to see her as a potential rescuer and lifesaver. She just might save Barb from this monster, we're thinking, because she's willing to go toe-to-toe with it. And the younger boys also mention that Nancy is kind of a badass now. So her stereotyped gendered reality, shopping for clothes to entice her new boyfriend, has changed to a less gendered alternate reality where she's going to fight monsters to save her friend and to save her friend's brother. And Jonathan also is interesting because his lack of shooting skill is not held against him in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, allows us to start to think of masculinity in a much more robust and interesting way, because his determination to save his brother echoes earlier moments with his estranged father, who I think we would say has some toxic masculinity characteristics, because he is Jonathan, excuse me, let me skip down here. Jonathan reveals to Nancy that his father took him hunting, and he says, he made me kill a rabbit. I guess he thought it would make me more of a man or something. I cried for a week. And so Jonathan and Will's interactions with sports and and not liking hunting help to make their characters much more independent of gender, of these gendered stereotypes that we've already seen in the 1980s. And so they become more interesting characters that we cannot necessarily know what we are expecting from them. And so those expectations change for us. We see this in later seasons also with Nancy continuing to become this investigative reporter, and she really won't take no for an answer. But again, I'm going to skip because another person who I think is really, really interesting is Steve. And so I want to mention him at least briefly. So Steve also initially follows this 1980s teen film script via his bullying behaviors. He breaks Jonathan's camera, he publicly scorns him. And then he turns against Nancy, spray painting slut and whore on the film marquee because he believes she is cheating on him with Jonathan. She's not. At this point, she is. They're fighting the Demogorgon. They're fighting, to try to find Barb and Will. So they have joined forces. And so even when he has a transformation and after being called out by Nancy, it's still kind of suspect because it follows the script. If you've seen 1980s depictions of wealthy, lazy boyfriends who realize their own lack of understanding, you've seen them in Pretty in Pink, Valley Girl, Tough Turf, these various plays where we've seen them before. So Steve's 360 doesn't really deepen his character. But later, when Steve shows up to help Nancy and Jonathan, even though he doesn't understand their relationship and doesn't know what they're doing, he becomes helpful and becomes helpful in saving Jonathan. And it is his lack of confidence that actually pushes his character development in new ways. So he's unsure about what he's fighting. He's awkward, he's terrified, he's unhelpful, and viewers cannot help but think he's about to literally step in a bear trap inside the house. But then his character becomes softened. He is humanized beyond bullying and drinking and sexual experiences to help Nancy and Jonathan fight a monster and to bring back Will and Barb. He becomes less of a 1980s caricature and more of a character with a developmental arc. And I would say this is in comparison to Billy, who in later seasons is hypersexualized and is another example of toxic masculinity. But I also think Billy is a really interesting character, just far less nuanced, and his recovery is much smaller than Steve's. There are lots of other gendered experiences with bullies, and I'm just going to at least move briefly to mention Joyce, because Joyce is such an important character too. Because initially depicted as a disheveled and disorganized grocery store cashier, Joyce develops into a really important leader here, and she forces a reevaluation of adult gender roles and socioeconomic class stereotypes within small town power structures. She never gives up hope, and she singularly labors to find her son, really distinguishing herself favorably from her ex-husband, who is constantly demeaning their sons in heterosexist ways. And I don't think it is an accident that we have the choice of having an adult version of Veronica from 1989's Heathers fighting against the wrestler from 1985's Vision Quest, Matthew Modine. And this is not lost on the audience. It's rather that the series has this tint of nostalgia, which is creating this larger sense of historical consciousness and a sense of intergenerational connection throughout. So I know that we're coming up on 25 minutes, so I'm probably going to wrap this up very much without a conclusion, because I don't think I have one yet, but that I can say that that the other seasons are really building on what transpires in the first and the second season, and that they are transcending these limited prototypes of 1980s nostalgia to reinvent themselves. And then they start to alter what we can understand about girlhood, about womanhood, and manhood, I would say as well, and heroism. What does it take to be a hero in 2022 versus 1980? So we start to make this progress from stereotypes and reevaluate what a hero could be and is. I'm going to stop.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. Thought-provoking, very rich and extraordinarily full. A great gift to all of us. I imagine there are folks in this group who have questions or comments or would enjoy being part of the conversation that I know will arise from your remarks, Dr. Putnam. So I guess I would open up the floor. Is there anyone who would like to comment, pose a question? Dr. Goulding.
Dr. Putnam, thank you so much. I'm sure I'm not the only one here for whom this is a trip down nostalgia lane. I love the way that you read into this series. And as I emailed you yesterday, anxiously awaiting the next season. I'd like to ask you, and maybe this is giving me away as an historian, what was it about the 1980s that is there? Do you do you have is there an historical kind of break point in the 1980s? I think I can sort of imagine some stuff, but I really wonder why did the folks who made the series choose that particular decade?
Well, I'm not sure that I know the answer to that completely, but I can hazard some wild guesses. First of all, we're far enough away from it that it becomes more of history, but we're still close enough to it that there are people who are my age. I'm 52, I'll share that. And so I was a child of the 80s. So, I grew up in that era. And so when you're watching, you have these mental connections to what you're seeing. And I think the first season really looks like the 1980s. You can see it, even the production of it looks like the 1980s. And you have big moments in the 1980s in terms of the Reagan years and the Cold War, supposedly coming to an end, ramping up and then coming to an end. So you have political things going on, as well as technology and film becoming so much more, I don't want to say nuanced, but with animation and the way that the filming changes. In the 70s, you have Star Wars, and you're moving into the 80s with great special effects. So I think we're kind of looking at those aspects from the 1980s. But I will also say that it has been an experience to watch this show with my daughters, who are 16 and 13. And when they watch it, they don't have any understanding of some of these things. My husband and I are like, look at that, look at that, look at that, and responding to it like this, where my children just see the storyline and they can pick out some things from the 80s, but not everything. Certainly not as many things as the adults are picking out. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
It certainly does, and I completely appreciate it, and I really love your work. Thank you so much, Amanda.
thanks.
Thank you. Do we have other questions and comments for Dr. Putnam?
I didn't raise my hand, so I hope it's okay that I just
Go
jump
ahead.
in. You know, Amanda, I really, when I was listening to what you were talking about, I thought of Eleven and Nancy and Joyce, and their seemingly lack of interest in doing emotional work. Because that's a very gender trait that we see today. At least this woman has experienced that quite a bit in her personal and professional lives. And I'm wondering if, like, one thing that unites them is their refusal to do that, as a way to, you know, maybe make a response to what was expected in the 80s and 90s, what we in Gen X, you know, kind of have this resulting baggage. Have you ever thought about that at all?
I haven't, but I love it. You know, I haven't thought about that at all, except in the way that I feel like Joyce becomes a mother figure in some ways to Eleven. You know, even when they're in the gym and they continue to kind of, they're trying to find Will, and they put her in the small pool of water, and she's very comforting to her, saying, I'm going to be there with you. I'm going to be there with you. And so it starts to make me think, that's kind of interesting that you said that they're not doing the emotional work, and yet they start to connect with each other.
I thought about like how they don't do that emotional work for the men in their lives, you know, and I especially see this with Nancy, especially as the seasons progressed. So it's just something I thought of when I was listening to you.
Well, you know, and when you mentioned Nancy, you know, when we end the season 1, she's still with Steve. And this is another thing that is a little different from 1980s films. So usually, you know, if you have this character that is kind of not the sexy boyfriend, you know, usually you're being drawn to this other character, and that's who you eventually end up with. Now she does in the other seasons, but not originally. She's actually, you know, Nancy is with Steve sitting on the couch, and Steve and her have bought Jonathan this other camera for Christmas. So it's interesting to think about how that ends, and then that she continues to get pushed towards Jonathan. I'm not sure. I keep thinking about whether she's doing the work or whether she's not, because I haven't thought about that. But I think that it's an interesting point to bring up. Joyce is also an interesting one when you bring her husband, I've lost his name, the guy who is her husband in, is it season 2? Yes. And he dies at the end. The Radio Shack guy. I can't think of what his name is.
Bob.
Yes, Bob.
Sorry.
You know, and that's kind of a funny relationship to me, because it sort of comes out of nowhere in some ways, and you're not really sure why they're together, even though she definitely acts like she's in love with him and on some level, and he is enamored with her. But it's an interesting thing to think about, Laura, in terms of whether there's an emotional connection with them, because there does appear to be an emotional connection with Joyce and Chief Hopper, which is kind of odd. So I don't know.
What else would people like to pose? Dr. Vaughn?
I was just going to say, you have a comment in the chat that I'll read aloud for you from Toby Hampton. I have to leave soon for a class, but I think you made some really good points that connected the decades. You said it very clearly that the experience from you and your husband watching it and your young children is very telling about what the directors and the writers try to convey for their audience. It's all very insightful. Thank you.
Oh, that's nice.
First of all, thank you, Amanda. I loved your presentation. And though I don't watch Stranger Things, I'm probably the only one on screen right now who does not. You explained it well enough that I could definitely follow along. And so kind of piggybacking off some of the other comments, I did a quick Google search and saw that 31% of viewers are 18 to 29, which is interesting. And it made me think about how, having been a parent and taking kids to Disney films or Pixar films, and how there's two audiences, right? You know, what we find funny, very different than what the kids find funny, even though, you know, there's obviously overlap. And so it does make me wonder how someone who's young and looking at, you know, feminism in characters from a very different perspective, from a different time frame, would perceive things so differently, and how purposeful that might be on the part of those making the show.
I think you're right that there are different expectations and different audiences for sure. I mean, you know, just the fact that you can binge watch the Netflix, you know, that they drop the entire season, that is geared much more towards that younger demographic than it is for me. I'm like, I can only watch one show at a time. Like, you know, I need to have a week in between it to think about it, you know, in my own way, while my kids can just gorge on it right away. But I also think it's interesting when you think about expectations, and I'm going to share something. So like when my kids watch, when they've watched movies from the 1960s or something, there was like an example of, I think it was Robinson Crusoe or something like that, where there was a girl dressed as a boy and she kept climbing on things and crying and falling down. Okay. And she was supposed to be a boy, but she was a girl. I mean, she was dressed as a boy. She was trying to hide her gender. My oldest daughter could not understand what was going on. She was like, why is she crying all the time? Why is she falling down all the time? They have expectations about what girls can and will do. So when they see 11 or Nancy just taking names and kicking butt, they don't see anything strange about that or new. That is how it is for them. You know, even when you see when they watch The Sound of Music and hear, you know, the oldest singing, I am 16, you know, going on 17, I need someone to watch over me. It doesn't fly as well with this younger generation, which I think is great. But my point with that is more that things have changed enough that they no longer, that they feel dissonance with that. They can't even watch it without questioning it. And maybe, I mean, they are my children, right? So of course they probably are going to, but I just feel like there's a big shift there. And I think that also goes back to Mark's point about what transpired in the 80s. So what actually transpired is in the 1970s, we had more women joining the workforce, joining things like this. And so then we start to see altered perceptions of what girls and women can do, right?
Thank you, Amanda. And I love pop culture looking at that. One of the things that I am curious about that I bring into some of my own pedagogy, but I think is really relevant here is you're touching on it between the, and I'll call it the generational gap, but certainly there's a need for a cultural knowledge to fully appreciate something and to understand. And I wonder if that might be the difference between you watching it and your children. And that's why you have to have that space, is because the cultural knowledge you bring to it, there's a deeper analytical level than the binge watcher who just kind of, it's almost like a rock across a pond, just skipping across and go, cool, you know, funny, fun, haha. And I wonder if that's something that, you said you had 2 or 3 papers coming out of this very large project. Is that something that you're also looking at? Is that sort of cultural knowledge and what maybe that background brings to our reaction to something?
I don't know. I feel like I have at least 3 things to prove in this already. So it's been growing like this each way. But I do think that's interesting what you're talking about, because I think that generational gap also occurs in the show. Because if Joyce and Hopper had been communicating with the boys and Eleven, who, if they had been communicating with Nancy and Jonathan, they could have pooled their information much better. You do see them working together better in the later seasons. So it sort of crosses that generational gap in season 2 and in season 3, where they've started maybe to make those connections, so that's kind of an interesting idea to me, but I'm not sure if that's where I'm going to go with it. I feel like I'm writing so much of it that I have to keep pulling things out and say, this is related, but not relevant to that thesis. And this is related, but not relevant. So I'm doing what I'm telling my students to do, right?
Great. And we have some interesting comments in the chat as well. Ms. Hatfield says, I really enjoyed Steve's relationship with the boys, especially when contrasted with the stereotype that he represented at the beginning of the series. It felt like a good example of toxic masculinity, healing and growing into nurturing masculinity. Dr. Wolf-Bellevaux notes, I agree. His and Dustin's relationships is one of my favorite subplots. Dr. Copley, I still wonder what social problem the Demogorgon is supposed to symbolize. Dr. Wolf-Bellevaux says, especially in terms of gender, violence, etc. I don't know, Dr. Putnam, if you wanted to comment on any of those comments or offer further reflections.
I don't know that I have an answer to what the Demogorgon is supposed to symbolize. I mean, I think there are a lot of things that it could symbolize. And even in the fact that it inhabits people and destroys them from the inside out. The fact that Dustin is able to befriend one of the demodogs, I think is what they call it, and so that I think that there are many things that it could symbolize, but I'm not sure. Mark says he wants to talk more.
No, I meant like later on, you and I can talk. I'm sorry.
Oh, he sent me a message. I thought he wanted to talk more.
No, I sent you a private. Sorry about that.
Yeah, but I agree, Lita. I mean, I think that monsters are considered kind of these social problems. And it's also interesting. I also read one time where somebody symbolized, felt like Barb was symbolizing almost that idea of virginity for Nancy, because that's why they kill her instead of the one who becomes sexually active. I don't know how I feel about that, but I thought it was an interesting idea. But I also like, and this is kind of going off of those, I also like how the fans are even involved in it, in the fact that there was this whole hashtag justice for Barb after the first season, because people were angry that Barb had been killed off instead of recovered, instead of recuperated, instead of saved. And that people keep wanting more justice for that character, which I think is an interesting concept too, in the sense that viewers are more active in trying to say what is a stereotype, or who is worth saving? Why is Will the only one that was worth saving when there were multiple people who were killed? So I went off on a.
And Dr. Putnam, is there something to be said about, and this is maybe more general to the 2010s, 2020s, that the fan base actually gets to call feels empowered to tell the people making the program, whether it's a film or a TV series. That seems to me like a really, really different thing than all of us sitting down to watch, I don't know, Barney Miller on Friday night at 8 o'clock.
Definitely that participatory element of 2020's culture, and the fact that you can just start hashtagging and then create a movement, you know, to change the way something will flow. And in fact, I read something recently that supposedly even 11 was supposed to die in the first season, and then they were supposed to move on from there. But maybe they weren't supposed to move on from there, that she was basically sacrificing herself, and they chose not to do that. So yeah, as Janine says, it's that fan culture that really becomes this dominant force. And again, that's the younger demographic, for sure. Something also I would say, when we were talking about the generational gap, I think just as a professor, it's really hard for me to watch something without starting to analyze pieces of it, because that's what we do. We like to critically think about what we're looking at or what we're reading. We like to engage. And so I'm not sure that the younger generation isn't willing to do that, because I think they're doing it in a different way. I think they're doing it via fan culture, for example, whereas a professor would do it in a more academic way, or around the dinner table, you know, to what do you guys think? You know? Mm-hmm. But I also wanted to go back to Kristen's point about Steve. I really think that he's a very interesting character. And I agree with you, Kristen, that watching him develop into this sort of big brother figure, which is not at all what the 1980s stereotype would have been. If anything, that 1980s stereotype would have been bullying them in the locker room, harassing them in just toxic ways. And for him to be telling them, you know, like what kind of hair gel to wear. I think he says that to Dustin at one point, and, you know, how to talk to a girl and things like that, really recovers his character in an interesting and important way.
Great. I want to acknowledge too, we have a comment from Bryn Danner, student here. Could the Demogorgon just be the collective weight of all the stress and social movements we are currently experiencing?
Well, Bryn, I mean, I think that that's possible, because I also think that the Demogorgon could be a lot of things. And so your answer really does create that, because what is the Demogorgon for you, right? What is the thing that is chasing you, that wakes you up at night, that upends your whole world? What makes you, you know, feel like a failure? And these are things that I think the Demogorgon does to each person in different ways. You know, even when we think about Billy later, you know, the Demogorgon scares him. And he is not the character that you would think would be scared, because he's that, you know, very ruthless, cruel, tough. And so in some ways, at first, we're almost glad that the Demogorgon gets, or the Mind Flayer, or whatever he's called in that season, you know, gets Billy. But then even Billy is recovered, and you realize that he had an abusive, toxic, you know, father, and that the father very possibly may have killed his mother in front of him, certainly beat her. So we have these senses of that the Demogorgon could be a lot of those things. So, you know, could it be the social, you know, the stress and the social movements? Sure. I think that could be one of the things.
Great. Do we have other comments and reflections? We're coming up on 4:30. It's been a very rich discussion. What are our sort of closing thoughts and reflections for this phase of what will no doubt be an ongoing conversation here in our college?
Well, one thing I will say is season 4 drops this summer. So, you know, it's gonna be a crazy thing. And I will share one more thing with you. This is me and my husband at a Halloween party in 2017. So we very much had a lot of fun with this, and enjoy the show. And it has been fun, I think, almost as a family to watch it. Because there's so many different little pieces of it that you can enjoy. So
Great. Well, please join me once again in thanking Dr. Putnam for a wonderful presentation and a very lively discussion. Our next new faculty lecture will be our artist in residence, Dr. Wendy Barnes, who will be reading from her work 2 weeks from today, 3:30 p.m. on Wednesday, the 2nd of March. I hope you'll be able to join us. Do take care, everyone, and have a great afternoon.